And for anyone that's interested, that playlist should now be public. You can find it here. This is the playlist of our past recordings. Typically it's of mostly the governance calls, but recently we've been recording our profiling calls as well. We have a single item on the governance agenda to really talk through today that we started to hint at the last governance call, but wanted a real deep dive and brainstorming on how we can start developing processes and ideas and tapping into our community to get through some of the challenges that we're currently having in the way that we're going through our issues and we're addressing our issues. Are there any other items that the community wants to make sure we get through or at least touch on today outside of this issue log item? All right. So I wanted to frame this a little bit. I think it's been something that we've been kind of verbalizing for a while now. We had a process previously where we would go through periods of time where we were community issue log heavy, where the idea was our profiling calls would be devoted to going through and actioning them and then going through and making the changes. And when our community issue log, and I'll put that here as well. So we host our issue log on FHIR. When the issue log was still kind of, I would say, like we were managing it like pretty well as items were coming in. It made sense to focus a lot more of our time on the profiling call on decisioning as opposed to kind of decisioning and also applying the changes on the profiling call, which kind of have left I would say, calling it misproperly weighted is probably not the right word, but we now have kind of landed in an outcome in that we haven't been actually making the changes on calls. We've been focusing a lot more on kind of principal work and talking through new mechanisms that could resolve some of the challenges that we're running into with existing implementers, that we have kind of still a bolus of issues that are remaining. And to me, this was the item that actually started to like make the alarm sound in the back of my brain a bit. Because when I see an issue log for a community owned and community developed project that has had, you know, a quarter of its issues that are already decisioned on, the actions for how, like what behaviors or changes that we want to actually incur have been made and documented, and we're really just looking at a lack of ability to get through it, that starts to kind of ring in my head to, we probably need to make a change in how we're addressing these, because we're not getting through even the stuff that should be easy peasy because the community decisions have been made and it's just about applying it. So that's in our kind of ready to be applied. And what I will say is when we started to apply the new FHIR tags, it got easier to kind of see some of these areas where we have a little bit more of a funnel problem, right? So, you know, a lot of these, like I said, like in each one of them, you can see an action that it's ready to be applied. We have captured kind of the community discussion, and any of these ones that have ready to be applied have like action item, which is, this is the change that needs to be made. So what I want to talk about today is kind of twofold. One is, how do we address what is effectively kind of a need for change, particularly in getting more help from editors, because effectively with me just putting in changes as I have time, we're not getting through the actual changes that our community has waited for, has asked for, and needs to see applied. As well as kind of brainstorm, how do we get through some of these that they've been in our log for a while, they're really challenging, given the type of request or the scope or the dependency on external parties, And like, are there maybe out of the box ways that we can start thinking through, how do we get through this? You know, is it we determine which ones can be broken down, which ones might be more appropriate for other projects. And then the last piece, I think, if we can get to today, that would be great, but it probably is an ongoing conversation for governance, which is, you know, say we can have that kind of technical relationship that we desire from between the CA baseline and the CA core. And we get a version of the CA baseline that is nice, it's tight, it has the changes that we want to see applied into it, the technical artifacts are sound. If we reach that, what do we want to start trying to establish as reasonable expectations for release schedules? So this is, I think, kind of an overtime maintenance thing that I think would be helpful to have these conversations first before we say, well, this release schedule makes sense, because in some ways it might be dependent on what we deploy in terms of ways of getting more hands in the pot. So I'll start with the first question. So many of us have been kind of editors in the past, or have been editors on other profiles or implementation guides, even if it's just putting in pull requests with the base FHIR specification, for example. We had initially, I think, about 3 or 4 folks that were kind of pitching in and actually making the changes and putting in the pull requests, and probably close to 5 people who were originally making the profiles as the substreams were working through them. But we really haven't had collaborative editing in a very long time. And so I want to tap into the brain trust that's here and ask, like, how we can make it easier, and how we can attract more folks to just any amount of kind of picking up a change here and there will help. Do folks have ideas in this space, or things that they've seen that works for others that we could co-opt?
Perhaps when we do assign an action item on a ticket, let's assign it to somebody. Who on the call is going to take care of this one? And there's several people who can help out a new editor if they want to get up to speed. But I think by putting a name on it, we can help. Let's take a look at all of Sheridan's tickets this week. Which ones have you moved on? And that'll put some pressure on people to move things forward.
And do folks feel like if we could carve it out at that kind of, so I'll give an example, because I really think, like, sometimes people feel really intimidated, but in reality, the actual types of tickets that oftentimes we're seeing are small. So let me just pull up an example before. So this one is a ready to be applied. It is, let's see. So remove cardinality on system and apply must support to this practitioner role specialty system. So that's a small change. Given, like, if folks are part of the calls and we're seeing kind of a really small compartmentalized out requests, is it reasonable? Do you think you'd raise your hand for this kinds of thing? And if not, what would you need to see happen before you'd raise your hand? Because I think, Elliot, you make a good point, which is like kind of assigning accountability. But I think the challenge that we also should think through from a governance side of things is like, when we go to apply this, how do we avoid silence?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a concern. I think part of that is we are welcome to contributions from anyone who wants to contribute. And, you know, I think if we start opening this up to others, to a larger community to contribute, we should put, you know, one of the things is we should put a lock on GitHub so you can't directly commit to the mainline, and put a requirement that every change gets every pull request gets a review. And that way, if people want to contribute, they can, and there's no, you know, there's not a significant risk of you breaking something. You don't need to be too worried, and someone will look it over and go, yeah, that's the right fix for this issue. We'll accept that.
Is that the driving worry that folks have in like raising their hand for making a change? Is it like worrying that you do something and it would break, or you do something and it wouldn't be right, but it would be in the baseline?
Yes, from my perspective, yes, means I am not very much comfortable in editing or doing something at this point. So that is why I'm more quiet on this, getting myself involved into making changes.
What about others? Is there other like things that are holding you back? So does that mean if we ensure that we have a branch that very clearly is supposed to be for community collaborator and pull requests, that people would start raising their hands? One thing that I thought that like, so the challenge that we have is this is supposed to be a community maintained and developed, you know, product. One of the challenges is that means that it always is going to require some effort. And I think some of what I've seen in other guides, let me actually just pull up the example in the base spec, is like the factors that increase kind of more ownership and like accountability when we have, for instance, let's see, like a contributors or an editor's page. So in the base FHIR specification, we have, I had this pulled up, but I have too many tabs open. A credits page looks like this. And it basically is, and this is also within a number of other implementation guides, a place for not just folks to also have, you know, to get the community recognition for the work that they've put in, but also to build confidence that, you know, this has had many folks working on it. It's had many eyes that have contributed into, you know, the content and the quality of the content that's provided. Would something like this make it, you know, because it is nice to be able to say, listen, I've contributed to the CA baseline. I have a distinct call out to just reckon back to the way that I've helped. Would something like this, while it's a little bit of a lift, make it more likely to have your name on this page. I actually think that a few of us actually have our names on this page. I saw a handful, but I don't know if that helps contribute to your decision to make pull requests and changes and contributions.
So
Maybe
having your name on this page or the equivalent of this, I mean, would that give you more clout with your employer and you'd be able to point to something and say, this is what I was working on? And, or if they knew that such a page would exist when it gets published, is that going to give you an okay to do that work? What I'm wondering is what's stopping people from contributing? Is it knowledge? Is it time? Is it?
I will say time is the main key factor for most folks. That is my perception. But
sorry, Lorraine, did you say something?
No, just let me hit pause here.
So, you know, I think we have to know what like the route is for us to effectively address this. So time constraints, you know, understand that. Are there other blockers that we need to resolve in order to have a solution to the editor problem? Because the other way I would ask this is, what happens if we don't get more editors? What should be the governance decision if we don't make any more future changes? And I think that is the scenario we're trying to avoid by trying to flip the script and say, instead, how can we put our thinking towards allocating reasonable amounts to the folks who are involved in the baseline? So maybe I will ask that question. What should happen if we don't get any more editors and don't have time to make these changes? Is there a state when like that would no longer be an option? Because I think if we don't do something, the current momentum is, even if we, for instance, start getting through, you know, more of these, we still have this challenge of always having a number in the hopper that still need to be applied. One of the, I thought Mike might show today, but one of the things that he had brought up was like ideas for trying to get folks that we work with that might be new to the industry to kind of raise their hand. So, you know, he mentioned like, doesn't have an intern now, but when he does, trying to bring them to the CA baseline and actually pitching this as an opportunity to learn how to make some changes in FHIR, because, you know, part of this is about the kind of cooperative value exchange of having helpers and also training that next generation of folks. Or if you yourself don't have the time today, are there members on your teams that you think that value exchange of, you know, you get a little bit more one-on-one help, particularly from the folks that are reviewing the pull requests, in exchange for just trying to do something? No one's got any interns? what do you think is the reasonable amount of time that you can spend on a given week on the baseline? Or what's the unreasonable amount of time that you know you can't?
I could probably, knock off one issue a week. That's not going to cut into my time. Not significantly. So that's, half an hour or something. If we had a few people all doing that and did that for a few weeks, we could probably make quite a dent in the outstanding issues.
And if we were, kind of asynchronously tackling the stuff that had already been decided, would folks want to focus on getting through the things that had been submitted but not decided on in our profiling calls? Because I think process-wise, we kind of need to decide, like, are we just going to focus like we've been doing, which is like get through decisioning and do application almost like offline, or deploy some type of process where we're splitting it or balancing them in some way. Like 1 week we're doing decisioning and 1 week we're doing application. Is it reasonable so right now we each spend 1 week, one hour per week on the CA baseline, 1 hour weeks like this towards governance, and most of us spend 1 hour on the profiling calls. So the other question that I have is, like, if we were to say, really focus like our efforts on getting through this, if folks can't commit that time outside of the calls, right, to do that half hour like Elliot mentioned, does it make sense to try to co-opt our governance calls for a while so that we can get through these on our governance calls or the slot, and then these during the regular profiling calls where we're just making those changes? Would anyone be opposed to that? Because if not, it might be worth trying. Like, I think, Elliot, I will definitely like put you up as our model citizen for asynchronous. Like, we all know now where the issue log lives and how to access issues that have very clearly defined action items that are already noted. If we spend our next few governance calls just going through the things that are still submitted, I mean, unless I hear differently, I think that might be one of the only ways to start getting through some of these. I think there is a larger question around what we do about some of them that maybe are larger than what we've been able, like, we've looked at them in the past and we just haven't really been able to get through. So some of our more major tickets that are like 2 years old, I'm going to pull up a few examples because I think we need to decide how we want to resolve some of these if we haven't been able to resolve them through discussion. Like, and I would posit that a handful of them are either not resolvable because they require a significant lift, or not resolvable because the scope and kind of principles of the CA baseline, they don't quite fit into what would normally fall into what we would make a decision on, or what we would have expertise to deploy to. So I'll pull up a few of them, and I want to get your thoughts on, like, can we do things differently so they don't just forever live on our backlog? So I've got specifically the ones that have been filed under submitted, and there's some that are also in the triage category as well. But I wanted to pull up like some of these like ethnicity existing enhancements. So these are like most of these are 2 years old. And so the things that live here in this spot tend to be some of the most increasingly challenging things for us to actually have a decision on. So some of them are things like, let's just pull up this issue real quick. Modifying an underlying value set that we point to, or I think there was one that was around creating new value sets. So there's a number of these that are related to kind of major terminology changes that, let me find another one that we just haven't really. Here's another, like I think ethnicity value set one that was oriented around the definition of this in SNOMED. And so like, there are things that we've been able to say like community notes, but something like a full overhaul of currently republished, meaning we're using things that are already published elsewhere, should be considered, feels really big. And feels like something where it's like, how do we approach this as a CA baseline community? And so my question is like, are there things in these types of requests that we can compartmentalize and that do fall within what we think the CA baseline can action, and other things, particularly now that we have the PC DCF, right? We've got the national information model and framework that's being developed. Like, are there pieces of this that we can say, listen, we'll package this up, we'll say this was feedback that we got, but was developed for artifacts that we don't govern? Like, is that a way of getting things kind of off of the docket and ensuring they're getting addressed in a channel that can address them? Should we just look at one of, so maybe the overhaul one is too overwhelming. But let's take a look at this one. Add attribute for racialized group. So there's a racialized group that was defined in the CHI reference model. You know, since I'm sure it's been published, there's been some updates. So there was a question about whether or not we should effectively create a new extension for a racialized group using, you know, assets that are existing from prior data model work. Do we think that this is the type of thing that we're still trying to scope in for changes in the CA baseline, or is it more, are there pieces of this that we think belong elsewhere? I'll zoom in, folks, and put it in the chat. How do folks think we should resolve this kind of thing? Would folks be opposed to making a generalized rule that says anything that is a net new terminology request or that involves updates to value sets we do not host should be brought up and resolved by their original hosts and not in the CA baseline?
Should just a suggestion. Should we post this invite or questions to the CHI forum and maybe also in the Zoom chat.
So, so you're saying these particular ones?
No, not this one, but in general, that we are looking for more editors. Maybe there are some guys who just simply doesn't know that such stream is going on. So
I think that's a good idea, because yeah, sometimes people don't join. Jamil, like, would you be comfortable like tackling on the Zulip front, like putting it out there that we are looking for more editors of the CA baseline? And I mean, basically, if they show up to one of the calls on Friday or email me, we can walk them through the process.
well, sure I can, but if you did if you do that directly, telling that contact me instead of me placing your email, but if you don't have time, I certainly can do that.
Yeah, I think like part of the exercise is about just really I need help. I like
Yeah,
and so
I'll
any
put in
amount of
a
help will help.
I'll put in a Zulip chat and
Perfect.
please also post that on the CHI forum. I don't know how many people are actually looking at that, but maybe someone will be telling that we're looking for. So maybe some co-op student would be interested to join.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because a lot of people are entering our community through those channels that may not otherwise, join the CA baseline without prompting. So it's posting the ask.
Mhm.
But so going back to the other question, which is with these, so we've always walked the line of sometimes being like the most frontline folks that are interacting with these value sets. And oftentimes this could be extrapolated to extensions as well, but that we don't host this information. When we get a request around making a new extension or updating an extension to include values, or updating, I'm sorry, a value set to include values from a more recently released origin, would anyone argue that that would be something that we should tackle in the CA baseline rather than kind of procedurally raise it with, the host of said value set? So should I make like so it's a little bit harder now because we did actually try to contact Vinny on this, and he no longer works at Kai, so it was a little bit harder to get an answer on one of these. But I do think that maybe the way that we handle ones like this is to create a category that just says, raise these to the appropriate working groups. So if there is a terminology working group that's going through the review or development of the, that pan-Canadian framework, raising the need for an extension that's been requested by community members will ultimately drill down to us, but maybe isn't the thing for the Kai to hold within its backlog for changes.
So take the position that we will document the use of existing Canadian terminologies, extensions, profiles, etc. But in general, we do not create new ones.
For these types of requests, yeah, how do folks feel about that procedural approach? Is anyone against that? So here's how I would frame this, and there might be a couple places that we can kind of copy and paste and categorize. So it's after actually that new extensions the scope of the CA baseline. How do I like the way that you framed it, Elliot, which is that the CA baseline will socialize existing extensions, and that's true. I mean, we have discussed that at length before, and will not in scope the development of new extensions, and will instead raise these requests when received. Actually, I'm going to say historically. Is it the national information model team that would make the most sense for this type of request? That it is through the CA core. What do folks think of this? I put historically received because I kind of think that like we may get these types of requests in the future, and the way we might want to handle it at that point is to say, that sounds like a similar thing that we've seen in the past. We think the right place of handling this is actually upstream into the very data model first, so that it can come downstream into the subsequent FHIR profiles. Is this fair or not? Is this not fair? Because I'm going to click submit if folks don't have a problem with this type of approach.
Do we have that a link to that team? Like right now, that's an ambiguous sort of some team out there. Can we specify what exactly that team is?
So I think that like if I was to resolve this today, I would ping Shannon McDonald, who's come to our baseline calls a number of times to reflect the PCHDCF lens, and say, can I submit these requests to you? Or is there essentially like an actual, not a listserv, but you know what I mean? Like an email for these types of requests. I anticipate that they will have that. But that's how I would get the answer, because that's the member of the team that's been coming to our baseline calls. Do we think we should call it out? Like, or maybe like wait until we have the actual who should be the person, or the email that all of these go to, or the JIRA ticket that these get submitted to. Because in some ways, like that's eventually where we want to be pushing people, but we'll have things in our backlog that we probably can at least help push their way.
I mean, if we can easily get this submitted to another body. I would say we should close this with a, submitted as ticket number, blah, blah, blah. And we'll look at it once they've addressed it.
You mean like this? Like in the future, we would have like I'm not seeing, I'm just on their site, like an actual JIRA, just the contact us piece, but when you said that we'll reconvene, what did you mean exactly by that? Like,
Well, so this ticket brings forward an issue to add in additional language or additional vocabulary rather.
mhm.
Once the PHDCF has dealt with expanding their vocabulary, we can come back and make sure that we reflect it.
So I think the way I framed it here, and we can modify this. So I anticipate if it's going to be developed, if there's a data set or if it shows up in the information model for this, that it will have a home in the CA core. And so more than likely, the choice would be, going back after it had been modeled in an artifact like the CA core. Because, for instance, I know nothing about the context of this request, right? But there could be a need, for instance, for some of these types of extensions or the value sets to have enforcement that we would never apply in the CA baseline. We'd only ever socialize it, but it may be enforced and further maintained and evolved through the CA core in ways that would always be outside the scope of what we're intending for the baseline to be. So in that way, it's kind of like we're more of like the downstream end to that. Because my thinking is like, this is the project that will have plenty of editors, right? So like, it's way more likely that having this and having us be a downstream recipient of things that we would socialize through the CA core makes more sense practically, but I'm curious what others think. Do we think the intent is like somewhere in between when these data sets come out to then make that extension in the CA baseline?
I'm not sure I see how CA core affects our decision.
Well, if we make it and CA, like if we make it in the baseline and we make it, let's say in parallel or like slightly ahead or slightly behind CA core, effectively you have two artifacts that are developing the same extension. Whereas by introducing the dependency of getting it from the CA core, you have one artifact that's developing the extension and another that is socializing it. The other thing is like, I mean, I think we should be talking about the fact that like, if we can't get through making changes that we already know what needs to change, I feel less confident adding effort to our future buckets to anticipate that like it'll be me making an extension or like me and one other person making an extension for these types of requests in the future through the CA baseline. It makes more sense to try to get these pushed through to the more restrictive guide that has capacity to make some of these extensions. Is there a different way? What am I missing? Is there something else that I should be thinking about with this?
I think that's a concern, but I'd be more concerned about aligning with not existing usage, but if we come up with our own value set or our own extension or something here, when there's already a value set that exists that some people are using, we're not going to get people to switch over just because we create it, or we create uncertainty by having different value sets. So I think that's the reason why we want to push it off to another, if this is the organization that created this value set in the first place, then we should be pushing on them to expand it for this additional content. And that's why I wouldn't want to take it on. We'll reflect it once they've said this is how they want things expressed, but we don't want to start generating confusion by saying, well, if you're using CA baseline, use this value set, but if you're using something from somewhere else, you're going to have to use a different value set to express the same thing. We want to be trying improve interoperability by getting everybody using the same content.
So is this like a better way of reflecting that? Reduce uncertainty around the duplication of both the extensions and the expectations for their use. Anything else that folks would want to see? Or I could say like, or subsequent, or because it may not be a CA core guide, right? Like, let's say something were to come out like that was like an explicitly implementation guide for reflecting ethnicity. They might want to host their own ethnicity extension that wouldn't be originally kind of originated in the CA core. Does that make it a little bit more comfortable for folks?
I just want to put out there one thing. Based on an experience I've had with something else a while ago, I had contacted a team that was working on a project about a defect. Basically did the analysis and said, well, the defect is in a third party's code that they were using. And that was the end of it. And so I'm kind of thinking here, if we sit there and say we're going to pass it off to somebody else to fix, we kind of have to hold back also the part of if they don't change it, then we have to look at it again if it's really needed in our stuff. Because otherwise people just get left in limbo and frustration because they find a defect and nobody that will fix it. Because it's not my problem from each team.
I
I
think
just
that,
don't want us to get into that kind of a state.
yeah, I think we want to avoid that mentality. Like there is a level of where we can't fix it, make sure it goes to a place that has that possibility. But I think what I would say is if these things matter to folks, also advocate for them in these streams, right? In your conversations and in the working groups associated with developing the data model. That's the best guarantee that we have that we aren't going to hear from a third party, well, we can't fix that. I think the thing we want to avoid is saying, well, we reviewed it here and it's, it'll go to the data set And if you really find this to be important, engage in that space and highlight that it should be fixed. Because like, you know, we can put it in, but you know, at the same time, it's each one of us, like, our responsibility to also be part of the working groups that are forming, that govern this content and ensure it looks the way you want it to look. I wish I had like an easier answer that isn't like we each will have to be involved, but I think there is like a better possibility in our community than in like a commercial community of not ending up in the answer of, well, it's somebody else's problem and it never gets fixed. But I'm an optimist.
So I do want a slight spin on that is, you know, how have we reached out to the submitter of these issues for something that is 2 years old and said, this was an issue that you raised. Is this still an issue? Do you still care about this? Do you want to withdraw the issue? Is it something you still want to see fixed?
So in this case, we did, but that isn't the case in some of the others.
Yeah, that was what I thought.
So hold on.
And HL7 does that from time to time when they're you know, looking at old issues. They'll reach out to the submitter and confirm that it's still something that needs to be dealt with.
So if I go to just our project page, let me just get that loaded. Let's look at some of our oldest. So, so outside of the ethnicity one, I think the attribute one was another FHIR one that we'd reached out about. Let's take a look at this procedure one. So this is one, and like I'll raise my hand for dropping the ball in this one. But like this was an action item, maybe not with the original requester, but we originally said, okay, we'll follow up with the health terminology forum. And I think that the challenge that presents in both cases is just if we don't do it on the call, chances are like it's going to fall off the radar. So maybe the thing to do is just to go through and make sure that like while we're on the call, we're going through the minutia of actually like trying to make that post to the InfoCentral forum for terminology. Is there another way we can do it that, or in the case of the thing I always struggle with, and I don't know, maybe you guys have figured out some other way of doing this, is that people move organizations very frequently in our Canadian community. And so sometimes you'll have like an email and then I no longer have it anymore, or it get a bounce back. Is there a way that HL7 has dealt with this? Is it just through Jira because you have to be a Jira account in order to put in a change request?
So it's mixed. People often will update their email when they move. Other people will, oh, I know how to get in touch with them. I'll follow up. But, you know, and this is something they've had to deal with in their official process. You know, if somebody votes negative on a ballot and then disappears from the scene, you can't publish with a negative vote. But if you can't get hold of them, what do you do?
No.
And so they've had to say, you know, into their official governance, we need to reach out to them X number of times, attempt to contact them, and then after that, we'll withdraw it, you know, or their organization or whatever. And I think that's you know, maybe something that we need to deal with. If we've got some of these that we can't progress and we can't reach the person, then we go, you know what? Maybe it's not such a big deal. Do we just cancel it? I need to run to my next call.
Yep. I'm gonna stop this recording and then maybe we'll pick it up on this item and start going through some of these at our next governance call.
Sheridan, can I ping you in an hour or so?
Yes.
I want to just